Salvatore, the very best in science fiction and fantasy.
I think the biggest difference between being 28 years old and 48 years old is that you're so much more sure of yourself in a lot of superficial ways when you're 28, and you're just much more grounded when you're 48. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when you're 28 and you're writing, you know everything. And, you know, there are no possibilities other than those you present, because you're young and you're immortal and you're wonderful, you know. And then you get a little older and you look at the world and you realize that there are perspectives other than yours, and there are truths. While the truth may be a constant, the perspectives that come to that truth aren't. And so not every answer is the right answer, and there isn't only one answer to so many things, especially about being human. It's such a complicated condition. And no, you're not immortal. And you look at the world in an entirely different way, and you try to find this grounding, you know. The typical midlife crisis that is that shake-up that you go through. And for me, it happened it was almost forced upon me when I was just after my 40th birthday. Well, I was almost 41 when my brother passed away, and he was a few years older than I am, and he was my hero, and that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. You know, we were supposed to be 85 years old and fishing in a stream together and just hiking on Mount Monadnock until one of us had to push the other one up in the wheelchair, and it probably would have been him pushing me. That's the irony of it all. And so you see so much more about the world, and you grow up as you grow up. That has, you have no choice but to bring that to your writing. And again, for me, I think between that incident back in 1999 when I lost my brother, and then publishing the Star Wars book that was so controversial and had so many people ready to kill me, that was quite a shock. And then watching what happened in 2001, which, you know, that morning I'm sitting at my table typing on the computer, and I was watching Good Morning America, you know, Charlie and Diane back then, and Charlie Gibson cuts away to the World Trade Center, and you see the side of the building burning, and my wife came over and said, boy, some pilot went off. Of course, they were saying it was a small plane, but I had been to the World Trade Center. I had actually done a book signing at the Borders, I think it was a Borders or a Barnes & Noble on the first floor of one of those towers. And I remember when I went down there's no way that was a small plane. These buildings are just huge. They're a city block around. And, you know, the world changed on that day. And then it brought me such great hope right in the aftermath of it. And then to see where we've gone from there. You know, so all these events, and especially now over the last few years where things have been so tumultuous and so, like, I mean, I remember a time in not too distant past when you could talk politics with people, and if you do it now, you're taking your life in your hands, one way or the other, right? And I see what's happening, and it's a little out of control for me, what's going on in the country and in the world, and of course that just puts you more on shifting sands, and that translates to the book. It translates to the book, you know, when you see perspective. And the other thing, I think, in fantasy in particular, what has happened in the world as fantasy has matured as a genre has forced upon fantasy a moving away from the old black and white stereotypes of fantasy. You know, back when I first started writing in the 80s, there were the good guys and the bad guys, and the line was clearly drawn. The orcs were bad, or the goblins were bad, or the dragons were bad, or the demons were bad, or whatever. And then the good guys were good. And you didn't have to explain that. But now if you look at some of the work that's come up since then, work of people like Gaiman and Mieville and George Martin's a perfect example of it, it's all gray. And fantasy has become, the audience has grown older as well. When I was reading fantasy back in the 80s and 70s and 80s, you know, the average age of the audience, I think, was much younger. Fantasy still appeals to the 15-year-olds, the 14-year-olds and everything, but it's also full of 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds. It's a mature genre now. And that black and white, well, he's bad because he's an orc and he's good because he's human, or an elf, that doesn't cut it anymore. And people they're not going to let you get away with that simplistic, you know, definition of who's what. It makes you work a little harder, I think. And the genre is much better because of it. It's a wonderful progression to watch. And I'm not saying that everybody was doing that. I mean, if you read Fritz Leiber or Michael Moorcock or Stephen Donaldson or Terry Brooks, there certainly were shades of gray in the books, but I think, well before, even back in the 70s, 60s, and even back further than that, there certainly were shades of gray. But there were also, in a lot of the books, a predominant black-white divide, if you will, of good and bad, good and evil. And I don't think you get away with that as much anymore. I don't think we want to get away with that as much anymore because now that the world is more interconnected, it's real hard to say someone, to demonize your enemy the way you used to. It's very interesting that right now both of my existing book contracts and my commitment to 38 Studios all end at the same time. And that was done on purpose. 2.5 years from now, I'm done. And I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if that means I'm done writing, or if I'm done writing fantasy, or if I'm going on to something completely different. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'm going to keep writing. Although the people that know me say, you're full of it and you will always be a writer. And that may be the case. I do want to try things outside of fantasy. It's hard, though. It's very hard. When you make a name in a genre now as a writer, they don't want to talk to you about writing another genre. And the people who have the work in the genre that you're doing don't want you to write another genre. Stephen King can get away with it, kind of, with doing the Dark Tower series, but most writers can't get away with that. So I would probably, if I wanted to go outside the genre, would probably have to write under a pen name. And actually, I do have a book I want to write, and I've wanted to write for many years now, that is outside the genre. And if I did this book, if I do this book, and I'm sure I'm going to because it's never going to leave me alone until I do, I won't tell anyone about it. And whoever comes in on the project will be under a non-disclosure agreement to tell them. I don't want anyone to know it's my book when it goes out there because I don't want it to be judged by the either positive or negative expectations that the reader's bringing to the book based on what I've done before, because I'll be outside the genre. And it was funny because I remember when I wrote Demon Wars, and Demon Wars books, the first series was a great departure from what I had done. Even though it was still fantasy, it was a different type of fantasy book than I had been doing with the Dark Elf books. And the community of fantasy there is a divide between the two. Not as big as people make it out to be, because the people online have the biggest mouths and always, amplify positions. I mean, if you go, like when I was at San Diego Comic-Con, George Martin was there as well, and we did a panel together. And it was going to be interesting to me to see what would happen when we went outside to sit down and sign books, how divided the lines would be. Was I going to have like one type of fantasy fan lining up for me, and George was going to have a different type of fantasy fan lining up for him? Because when you look at it, I mean, you could make the case that we're not even writing in the same genre with the type of work we're doing. But what stunned me, pleasantly, and I think George as well, because we talked about this, was that people would come up to him and they would pull out their backpack and they would pull out 3 or 4 just dog-eared, well-loved, well-read copies of his books to get them signed. And then they'd step over to me and pull out 3 or 4 of mine in the same way. And we kind of looked at each other and we were like, yeah, this is the way it's supposed to be. And that was a great experience for me. But when you go outside the genre now, I don't want people taking those expectations. If I'm writing a serious book about contemporary times, I don't want them to think that some dark elf's going to jump out of the closet and start cutting people up with scimitars. I don't want them bringing that to the book. I remember it was one of the, I think, probably most cynical moments I've had as a writer when my Demon War books went out. One of my Demon War books went out to a particular reviewer who obviously was no fan of the shared world fantasy, the Forgotten Realms fantasy, those types of books at all. And the editor said to me, I wish I could have sent them the book without your name on it. because they missed everything that was in there, expecting something completely different from me. And when a professional reviewer does that, you know, that's pretty bad. And that was a very, very tough moment for me. It was like, they'll love this book if your name's not on it. What does that even mean? But that's the reality. So to go outside the genre, and I will, I hope, I'm not telling anyone. And I'll have someone else sit in this chair and do the interview if we have to do some video interview for that book.